To get started. Thank you everyone for joining us both in Zoom and on person for our first one-on-one talk of the fall semester. So for those of you who don't know, HBI, or the Harvard Brain Science Initiative, is a group sponsoring this. We are a group organized by the Office of the Provost to try to connect the medical school campus and the undergraduate campus and neuroscientists at all the different affiliated hospitals of Harvard together. So we do a bunch of community building activities. And we're really excited today to have with us Professor Daniel Schacter, who is a professor in the psychology department at Harvard. He's a world expert on human memory. He has been at Harvard for, I think, about over 30 years, 10 of which he had served as the chair of the department from 1995 to 2005. His official title is the William R. Kenan Jr. Professor of Psychology. His research interests include understanding memory distortions, the effects of aging on memory, as today's talk title implies, connections between memory and future thinking, creativity, imagination, understanding the relationship between implicit and explicit memories. And he has an impressive over 500 different articles and book chapters that he's written. He's the author of several books, including two New York Times notable books of the year, Searching for Memory in 1996, The 7 Sins of Memory, which came out in 2001 and recently had a 20th anniversary edition. He did his PhD at the University of Toronto, undergraduate work at the University of North Carolina, and he also served on the faculty of the University of Arizona for some time before coming to Harvard. So we're really delighted to have you with us today, Professor Schacter. I'll hand it over. Oh, one quick thing, please feel free to take food on your way out.
All right, thank you for the introduction. Thanks for having me here today, and thanks to those of you who are here in person and those of you who are on Zoom. And what I'm going to try to do today is kind of give you a broad overview of some of what my lab and the field more generally has been up to in the domain of memory and imagination. We all know how much we depend on memory in our everyday lives. We could hardly think of functioning without it. And yet one of the most interesting things to me about memory has always been that it is not just a perfect recording of what's out there. It's not just a video recording of what we've experienced. It's a more dynamic, constructive process that's prone to error. And one of the ways that we know about this, in addition to laboratory studies, is through events in everyday life. So what I'm showing you here is a slide and take us back almost 30 years now to what most of you will recognize as the Oklahoma City bombing, a horrific event where the Murrah Federal Building was blasted, resulted in 168 dead. And what those of you who are old enough, and I see that most of the people here are probably not old enough to have been around when this happened, but those of us who were around will remember that in the days after the Oklahoma City bombing, there was a search for two people. They were referred to as John Doe number 1 and John Doe number 2, all right? John Doe number 1 turned out to be Timothy McVeigh, who was arrested and convicted and ultimately executed for his role in this horrific bombing. John Doe number 2, however, was never found, even though a witness claimed that he had seen Timothy McVeigh and this guy referred to as John Doe number 2 rent the van that was used to carry out the bombing at a body shop outside of Oklahoma City. And he provided this very detailed instruction of the guy referred to as John Doe number 2, which I'm showing on the screen, down to his Carolina Panthers base football cap and other details. So what had happened? Why could they never find John Doe number 2, at least as someone who's involved in the Oklahoma City bombing? Well, it turned out that John Doe number 2 was the result of a really interesting memory distortion, which is why I'm talking about it. What had happened is that the eyewitness who remembered seeing McVeigh together with this guy He turned out to be Private Todd Bunting, an innocent man who had nothing to do with the Oklahoma City bombing. And you can see there's a pretty good match between the sketch and the photograph of this guy, Todd Bunting. So how did he get involved? Well, he was at this same body shop where McVeigh rented the van used to carry out the bombing the next day with somebody who kind of looked like McVeigh. And this eyewitness mixed up the elements of these two episodes and he fused them together in his mind. And he claimed that Todd Bunting was there with Timothy McVeigh. And it was about a year later that this guy, Tom Kensinger, admitted his mistake where he realized that he was actually remembering an innocent man, Todd Bunting. He came to this realization about a year after the mistaken memory. Well, it turns out that this kind of occurrence is not isolated. We know that memory errors are one of the main contributors to mistaken eyewitness identification. The Innocence Project has shown that roughly 70% of people who were sent to jail for crimes they didn't commit and later exonerated on the basis of DNA evidence were put there on the basis of these kinds of memory errors. So we know that memory errors can really have a negative impact on everyday life. The question that has interested me is, why do we have what many people in my field would call a constructive memory system rather than a rote or reproductive memory system? Why do we have a memory system that is prone to the kinds of errors that I just described and others as well? Well, this was a motivating factor in my writing of the book on the 7 sins of memory that we just heard about. It was initially published in 2001, and then happily I had a 20th anniversary edition in 2021, where I described 7 different ways in which memory can be prone to error. I'm not going to go through them in detail because we're really just going to be focusing on one, but going back to an original article I wrote on this topic and published in American Psychologist in '99, and then the 2001 book, I talked about what I thought were the 7 different ways, fundamental ways in which memory can kind of let us down. 3 different kinds of, 3 different sins of omission, as I refer to them, different kinds of forgetting, transience, the decreasing accessibility of memory over time, absent-mindedness, a different kind of forgetting, where lapses of attention result in forgetting to do things, blocking, another kind of forgetting, but with a different underlying mechanism. This refers to situations where information is available, but we can't get at it at the moment we need it. And then there are 4 sins of commission: misattribution, which I'm going to come back to in a minute, suggestibility, that's implanted memories that sometimes turn up in these legal cases, bias, that refers to retrospective distortions produced by our current knowledge and beliefs and skewing our recollections of the past, and then finally persistence refers to unwanted recollections that we can't get out of our mind, intrusive memories that often will arise as a result of traumatic events. Well, one of the main points I made in writing about the 7 sins is that even though they can have very serious consequences in everyday life, I raised the question of whether they really and truly are sins. And what I mean by that is that even though, again, each of these has significant negative consequences in everyday life and deserves to be called a memory error or dysfunction of some kind, I try to make the argument that each of them also is kind of a consequence of adaptive features of memory that make it generally work well most of the time. So, for example, yeah, we forget a lot in different ways, but we wouldn't want a memory system that retains every detail of every experience. And in thinking about this adaptive question, that was one of the original ideas that I put forth with respect both to forgetting and also this memory sin of misattribution, where we remember some aspect of an event correctly, but get the source or the context wrong. We misattribute our memory. That's exactly what was going on in the Oklahoma City bombing case involving Tom Kensinger. He remembered some aspect of an event correctly, but he got the context wrong. And one account of that is that sometimes, again, we're better off remembering just the gist of what happened. That can promote the retention of the meaning and general themes of experience, but can set the stage for misattribution errors of the kind we talked about. And this was very much in the spirit of the work of Sir Frederick Bartlett, psychologist in the audience will be familiar with him, a gigantic figure in psychology who back in 1932 published his book on remembering, where he documented the occurrence of various kinds of memory errors when people remembered stories, and provided a theoretical account roughly along these lines, that we don't want a memory system that records slavishly every detail of every experience we've ever had. We're pretty good at getting the meaning or the general themes of experience, and that can serve us well in many situations. So that was kind of one of the arguments I made in the 2001 version of the Seven Sins. But by 2021, a whole series of events in my lab and elsewhere had kind of, if not changed, expanded my thinking about the adaptive aspect of misattribution errors and memory distortions more generally. And that's what I want to focus on today, because this has to do with a line of work that has explored the relationship between memory and imagination that I believe has important implications for understanding some of the kinds of memory distortions and errors to which we are prone. And so to get started with this, I want to take you back, almost 40 years now, to the 1980s when I was working at the University of Toronto and doing a lot of work with amnesic patients who, as a result of damage to specific parts of the brain that are important for memory, lack the ability to remember their recent experiences. One of those patients is shown here in the slide, amnesic patient KC. He had had an injury, head injury in the early 1980s that damaged his hippocampus, a structure that we'll talk about in more detail in a few minutes, which, as memory researchers know, along with other nearby regions in the inner or medial aspect of the temporal lobe, is very important for memory. KC had damage to the hippocampus, medial temporal lobe, frontal lobe, and a couple of other regions, even though he was not globally cognitively impaired. And very strikingly, this is KC as I remember him from the 1980s. This is KC as an older man, and he passed away a few years back. So he was, if not unique, what stood out about him is that he lacked the ability to remember any specific episode from his past. No matter how hard you try to pull out a specific recollection from KC, you couldn't get it. You could get general knowledge. He knew who his parents were. He knew where he grew up. He could tell you about the neighborhood he lived in, but he couldn't tell you anything, any specific event that had happened in his life, including what had happened even an hour ago or yesterday. So there was a very kind of fateful testing session in which I was present, along with Endel Tolving. Endel Tolving is one of the most important figures in modern memory research. He was my PhD supervisor. Sadly, he just passed away last week at the age of 96. I have many fond memories of Professor Tolving, and one of them occurred in this session, which he reported in a paper published in Canadian Psychology in 1985, where he's talking about he and his colleague, namely me, at the University at the Unit for Memory Disorders, were observing this young man. This is patient KC. He happened to refer to him as NN in this article. He was referred to by a variety of different initials in the literature. And here's the interesting thing that happened in this session. So Tolving has been asking him about what he's going to be doing tomorrow, and he just can't come up with any information. So he says, let's try the question again about the future. What will you be doing tomorrow? Patient smiles faintly and says, I don't know. Do you remember the question about what I'll be doing tomorrow? Yeah, he had an intact immediate memory. He could remember what was just said. Yeah, how would you describe your mind when you try to think about it? Blank, I guess. That was really, for us, a stunning observation, because we knew that if you asked him what was he doing yesterday, he'd say, I'll just come up with a blank. But thinking ahead to the future and you ask him, what will you be doing tomorrow, has that same blank. If you push him hard enough, he might give you some generic information like, well, I'll have breakfast, I'll have lunch, but he couldn't conjure up any particular episode that might happen to him any more than he could remember an event that had actually happened to him. Tolving went on to write some interesting papers about how memory might be related to the future. I percolated on this for a long time and wondered, well, how can we really study future thinking and link it to remembering? But didn't really do anything about it until a postdoc showed up in my lab in 2000 and 2005 by the name of Donna Rose-Addis. And she had been doing some studies in her PhD at the University of Toronto on autobiographical memory, where people were put in the functional MRI scanner, they were given word cues and asked to remember events from their past. And she had some very interesting findings. So we started talking about, could we extend this work on fMRI of autobiographical memory to fMRI of future imagining and compare the two. So that's basically what was done in this early study. It was published in 2007 that was led by Donna. And so this is a cartoon taken from a Nature Reviews Neuroscience paper that we with Randy Buckner published back in 2007, reviewing some of this work as it was just coming on the scene. So here you see the participant is in the scanner. They're given a cue word, and here in the thought bubble, I remember taking a day trip last summer and walking on the beach. That would be in response to a cue word such as vacation, and instruction to come up with an event that had happened to you in the last few years related to vacation. In the other thought bubble, I imagine picking out a puppy in the pet shop next year. That would be in response to a cue word such as dog, and instructions to imagine a related event that could plausibly occur to you in the next year related to that cue word. And what happened was that there was a striking similarity in the brain regions that showed increased activity when people remembered past events or imagined future events compared to a couple of control tasks that I'm not going to go into. So you can see strikingly here, these midline regions, the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate, precuneus, show very similar increases when you remember the past and imagine the future. We found the same thing for the hippocampus, medial temporal lobe, and a couple of lateral temporal and parietal regions. So based on that finding and a couple of other studies that were coming online at the time, we postulated the existence of what we called a core network that we postulated was involved in remembering past events, imagining future events, and supporting related kinds of mental simulations involving those midline regions that we just looked at and the other regions that showed similarly increased activity when people remembered the past and imagine the future. There are only a couple of studies to go on at this time, but shortly after 2007, research in this area really took off. And by 2015, Roland Benoit, who was a postdoc in my lab at the time, led a meta-analysis based on a much larger sample of studies. And what you see here is that it's those very same core network regions that are showing similarly increased activation for episodic simulation, imagining future and other hypothetical events, and episodic remembering a particular past event. So that gave us great confidence that, in fact, there is this core network that is supporting both remembering the past and imagining the future. There were other similarities between these two forms of cognition that we knew about even back in 2007. I've put up a couple of reviews if anyone's interested in following up on this. It turned out that KC was not alone. Other amnesic patients also exhibited difficulties imagining their personal futures. And some of the work from Eleanor McGuire and Demis Hassabis, imagining novel scenes. In a series of studies in my lab with Donna Addis, we found that when we asked older adults to remember past experiences and imagine future experiences, they showed a similar reduction in episodic detail, remembering what happened, where it happened, who was there, for both past events and imagined future events. So when they imagined it to the future, the older adults were imagining future events with less episodic detail than younger adults, and to pretty much the same extent as we observe for remembered past events, and ditto for patients in early stages of Alzheimer's disease. So based on the evidence that we had at the time, Addis and I put forth an idea we call the constructive episodic simulation hypothesis. And here we're linking this work on remembering the past, imagining the future with the work on constructive memory that I talked about at the beginning of the talk. So we argued that episodic retrieval, and that of course comes from Endel Tolbang. He was the one who came up with the concept of episodic memory and contrasted it with semantic memory. So we tried to argue that episodic retrieval is traditionally associated with recollection of past personal experiences, also plays a key role in imagining or running simulations of possible future scenarios. And we suggested that it did so by supporting the flexible retrieval and recombination of elements of stored episodes to construct possible future episodes. So the idea is that when you're imagining a future event, this is a very adaptive process, this flexible episodic recombination, because the future, after all, is rarely identical to the past. So we need to be able to simulate novel situations based on our past experience. And we're suggesting that our very flexible episodic memory allows us to take bits and pieces of past experiences, recombine them, and run simulations of new upcoming situations. So we think that's a very adaptive use of episodic memory. But now linking back to the beginning of the talk, we also argued that episodic recombination can also result in memory errors when elements of past experiences are miscombined. So maybe one of the reasons why good old Tom Kensinger back in the 1990s mixed up these elements of the two episodes that we talked about is that because his and our episodic memory is really designed to allow us to flexibly recombine information to run simulations of novel experiences, but this is a price we pay. So this is kind of the new idea that came on the scene as a result of this work on future imagining and its relation to memory. So what I want to do today now in my remaining time is unpack for you some of the work we've been doing on the mechanisms involved in episodic recombination and simulation, and then talk about some recent experimental work that experimentally links episodic recombination and memory errors. All right, so let's talk about mechanisms a little bit. We've taken two approaches to this in my lab over the past decade or so to trying to nail the mechanisms of flexible episodic recombination. One is a procedure that I'll tell you about in a moment called an episodic specificity induction. And then the second is by the use of transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, a way of impacting brain activity by applying a magnetic pulse to the surface of the cortex. Okay, episodic specificity induction. This is a procedure that we began working with almost a decade ago. And studies in my lab were led by two then graduate students, Kevin Medor here on the left and Helen Jang. So what is episodic specificity induction? Well, it's brief training in recollecting the details of a past experience, where we're trying to get you in the mode of really remembering an event in the past in a lot of detail. And then what we're interested in is how that impacts subsequent tasks that we give you. So for our episodic specificity induction, we adapted a well-known procedure, the cognitive interview, which is a forensic protocol that's been shown to increase episodic retrieval in eyewitnesses. And it does so by walking you through a series of steps to get you to think back to a past event and really remember all the details that happened. So the logic of our studies was that by activating or biasing episodic retrieval processes through our modified cognitive interview, this ESI should have selective downstream consequences. It should boost performance on later tasks that draw on episodic retrieval, because we've cranked up these detailed episodic retrieval processes, such as future imagining, but should have little or no effect on subsequent tasks that we don't think have anything to do with episodic retrieval, such as describing a picture that's right in front of you. So let me give you an example of the ESI. Typically in these experiments, what happens is subjects watch a video of people doing routine activities in a kitchen. There are various ways of doing these experiments, but this is the most common one. And then after you've just seen this video, you get one of two different kinds of inductions. In the ESI, people are told to close their eyes, get a picture in their head about the people in the video you saw. I want you to think about what they look like, what they were wearing. Once you have a really good picture, I want you to tell me everything you remember about the people in the video. Try to be as specific and detailed as you can. So that's our ESI. And we go through that not only for people, but for actions and objects. And then we're going to look at how that impacts subsequent performance. Now, we have to have something to compare that to. So we also have participants, and these are typically the same people undergoing ESI or control inductions, usually separated by a day or a week, counterbalancing the order, of course, of inductions. And they see a different version of the video, the same people, but now instead of being asked to unpack a detailed episodic memory, they're asked to give their general impressions. What did you think of those people in the video? Did you like the video? When do you think it was made? So in both cases, if they're thinking back to a video in one induction, they're remembering a lot of episodic detail. The other, for the same amount of time, they're giving their general impressions. And then what we're going to do is see how these two inductions impact performance on these three tasks, all of which involve presenting one at a time a picture cue. So in the memory condition, you're supposed to remember a past experience related to the picture. So here, if I show you this picture, you might remember the vacation you took on Cape Cod last summer and unpack for 3 minutes all you can remember from that experience. We think that's an episodic dependent task. That's obviously drawing on episodic memory, therefore should be impacted by just having had the episodic specificity induction. For other pictures, we're going to ask you to imagine a possible future experience. So here's a picture of a shopping mall, and you might now, if that's in the future imagining condition, imagine you're going to take a trip to the shopping mall next month, and imagine the things you're going to buy, the stores you're going to go into, unpack that in all the detail that you can. And the third condition is just describing the picture. So here you might say, oh, it's a picture of people in a dance hall. There's a man here with a sport jacket, a woman with a purple top, and so on and so forth. So these first two tasks, we think drawn episodic retrieval should be impacted by just having had the specificity induction compared to control. This has nothing to do with episodic retrieval, and so you shouldn't be any impact of which induction you just had. Okay, so we did this as an aging experiment. We had 24 young, 24 older adults. They come in for 2 sessions. They see that video that I told you about. They get either the specificity or control induction, and then they go on to do each of those 3 tasks. A week later, they come back to the lab. They see a different version of that video of people doing stuff in a kitchen. They get whichever induction they didn't get the first time around, and then they do different, they have different cues for the memory, imagination, and description tasks, okay? And the way we code this is through a well-known procedure in our field. It's called the autobiographical interview, developed by Brian and Levine and his colleagues 20 years ago. And basically what this does is divide the protocols, the verbal output, what people tell us, into 2 different kinds of detail. Internal details, let's focus first on memory imagination, basically are episodic details. Who, what, when, where details. External details are non-episodic details, commentary that people make, inferences that they draw, related facts that they provide.
Hello.
And so this is where we think most of the action is going to be, the internal details, because these are the episodic details that we think will be impacted when you're remembering the past or imagining the future. For picture description, what we code as an internal detail is a detail that's actually in the picture that you can see, and external details are commentary, inferences, related facts.
I don't need any.
So what happens when we do this experiment? What we find is when we focus on the internal details, let's look at the memory and imagination task first for young adults. Following the specificity induction, you can see the blue bars are higher than the gray bars. That is indicating that, in fact, younger adults are remembering past events and imagining future events with more episodic internal details after they've just had that induction than when they've had the control induction. The same holds for older adults. They don't give you as many internal details. I mentioned that earlier, but they too are boosted by the specificity induction. Critically, there's no impact of the specificity induction on the picture description task as predicted, because that doesn't really draw on your episodic retrieval, whereas the memory and imagination tasks do. And this effect is selective to internal details. If we look at external details, older adults tend to provide more external details. They give you more commentary, sometimes off-topic rambling, to be honest, that's coded as external details, but there's no impact of the induction as expected on external details, because these don't draw on your episodic retrieval and recombination. So we concluded on the basis of that initial experiment that the episodic specificity induction is dissociating the retrieval of episodic details during remembering and imagining from retrieval of non-episodic information, it's the external details, and non-episodic narrative processes. That's the picture description task. We went on to replicate that, and other labs have replicated that finding with slightly different paradigms. We extended it to an interesting phenomenon of means end problem solving. I'm not going to go into this in any detail. I'll just show you the title of one of Helen Jing's experiments, worrying about the future. So people often have issues in everyday life that worry them. For Harvard students, for example, how am I going to pass my exam? And so in this experiment, people were given what we call a means end problem solving task, where you list problems that you're worried about, and then your task is to come up with means to solve that problem so you end up in a good place, passing your exam. What Helen Jing's study showed is that after you've just had the episodic specificity induction, you come up with more constructive steps to solving your everyday problem, in this case, doing well on an exam or other issues that are pertinent to Harvard students. And the idea is that that's drawing on episodic retrieval to help construct a simulation of a future event that would impact problem solving. So we found similar effects on that. And in a line of work that we've been doing a lot with lately, we've also found similar effects on divergent creative thinking. So what exactly is that? Divergent thinking is the ability to generate creative ideas by combining diverse kinds of information in novel ways. That goes back to ideas put forth by the psychologist Guilford way back in 1967. And that kind of sounds a lot like episodic simulation, the way I've been talking about it. And indeed, there's some evidence that was suggesting that episodic retrieval and recombination can contribute to divergent thinking. So for example, in the alternate uses task, which I'm going to tell you about in more detail, which is kind of a standard test of a divergent thinking, where I give you an object like a brick or a tire, and I say, come up with a novel use of a brick or a tire. In a couple of studies, we found that the number of episodic details that people provide when they imagine future events is positively correlated with the generation of appropriate and novel uses on the AUT. And therefore, we predicted that giving people the episodic specificity induction would boost performance on the AUT. And indeed, in a couple of studies, that's what we found. This is the first one. The procedure is pretty much the same as I just told you about. You see that video. You get either the specificity or control induction that we talked about. And then you do the AUT. I'll say more about that in a minute. Or an object association task where you're given a word cue and you just generate highly associated objects. And you do this in 2 different sessions where you're seeing different versions of the video. You get ESI or the control induction here. You get whichever induction you didn't get the first time around in the second session. And you do different versions of these 2 tasks in the 2 sessions. So for the alternate uses task, we might, for example, give you the word coin. And now you've got to come up with novel uses of a coin. And you can score it for the total uses that people come up, appropriate uses, whether it could actually work, categories of appropriate uses that fit under one category. I'll explain that in a minute. And the most commonly used measure for AUT is categories of appropriate uses that fit under a category that are also appropriate, sometimes referred to as flexibility. So let me just give you an example. So for coin, if you say, well, you could use a coin as a board game piece and use it as a bingo chip, those are both novel and they're both appropriate, but we're only going to give you credit for one under the category scoring criterion, because we don't want you listing 20 different games for which you could use a coin as a board game piece. And then another example for shoe, holding an adult in it, holding a big screen television in it. Well, that's novel, but you don't get credit for that because they wouldn't actually work, inappropriate. The object association task now is you just give an object cue and you come up with familiar items. We don't think that should be involved very much in the way of episodic retrieval and recombination, where we thought the AUT would. And in fact, that's exactly what we found, increase performance on the AUT. So here, that red bar is higher than the blue bar following the ESI, the specificity induction. So after you've just had that episodic specificity induction, you're coming up with a couple more novel and appropriate uses of these objects and no impact on the object association task. We recently extended this in some work from my student, Ruben van Genoegden, to a creative writing task. So here, after you've had the ESI or control induction, participants read brief passages from literature and were instructed to continue writing the story as creatively as possible. And across 2 experiments, participants wrote stories that contain more episodic details after ESI than a control induction. Those are the combined results. So after they've had the ESI, their stories are richer in episodic detail when they're trying to write creatively. Well, these behavioral findings, when the initial ones that we had available to us a few years back, led to some predictions regarding brain regions targeted by the ESI. We thought that core network regions previously linked with retrieving episodic details should be influenced during imagination or divergent thinking tasks preceded by the ESI. So we carried out a couple of fMRI experiments that have supported that. So here you're doing the future imagining task in response to a single cue word, imagine a personal future event. And as the control task, I'm not going to go into this in any detail, you also get a cue word and you have to generate a particular kind of sentence. We've used that control task in various other experiments. And we're scanning you after you've just had the ESI or the control induction. We didn't scan during the 2 inductions. And the question is, would there be an impact in core network regions that are known to be associated with episodic detail selectively on the future imagining task? We replicated behavioral data, and indeed, what we found is that if you just look overall separately at regions that showed increased activity when you imagine a future event compared to that object control task, what you see is both following ESI and following the control induction, you see those core network regions coming online. But even eyeballing it, you can see it looks like the findings are a bit more robust following ESI. And look at this activity in the vicinity of the hippocampus. You don't really see much there following the control induction. And a tighter contrast that asks the question, what regions show greater activity when you imagine a future event compared to the control, and also show greater activity following ESI versus the control induction, then indeed you get core network regions previously linked to retrieval of episodic details. So that indicated that indeed the ESI is boosting some of these brain regions that we know from other studies are important for episodic retrieval and that we think are playing an important role in the future imagining task, but not the control task. And we can tell a similar story for divergent creative thinking. We did the same kind of experiment, but now you're comparing the alternate uses task to the object association task that I told you about a few minutes ago. And when we do that tight contrast that I just showed you, we get the same hippocampal region showing increases for specificity versus control and for AUT versus the object association task. We didn't see those other regions for future imagining, so it wasn't exactly the same finding. And we also found some prefrontal regions involved in cognitive control that others had found to be important previously for the AUT. We've elaborated recently on some of the theoretical implications of these findings. I won't have time to go into this in any detail really at all in this talk, but a collaboration with my colleagues Matthias Benedict, Roger Beatty, and Yoav Kenan just published earlier this year. We kind of traced out some of the theoretical implications of these and other findings, linking episodic and semantic memory to creative thinking in this article, for those who are interested. All right, how are we doing on time? We're not doing as well as I'd like, but that's all right. Let me say a few words about our work with TMS, and then I do want to leave time to get to one of my favorite studies. That's the one that links some of this episodic recombination to memory errors. So TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, that's basically a way of impacting brain activity by applying a magnetic pulse that impacts activity right under the cortical surface, primarily, though not entirely. And in 2017, Preston Thackrell, when he was a postdoc in my lab, led a study, just going to summarize it verbally here, in which inhibitory TMS was applied to the left angular gyrus. That's a part of the core network that I showed you earlier. And after that, people were given those remember a past experience, imagine a future experience tasks that we've talked about, and also a semantic free association task. And what this study showed was that after Preston applied the TMS to these participants on these later tasks, there was a similar reduction in episodic details provided when people remembered past experiences, imagined future experiences, when compared stimulation to the angular gyrus to TMS to a control region. But there were no effects on a semantic free association task. So we think that provides some nice converging, more causal evidence for one of these core network regions in supporting remembering the past, imagining the future. That work was extended in 2020 based on an interesting feature of TMS, which is that application of TMS to the angular gyrus, although it really most strongly affects the underlying region, also impacts regions that are connected to the angular gyrus. This was shown in an important study by Wang and colleagues and published in Science back in 2014. So this study used an fMRI-guided TMS approach to the left angular gyrus compared with a control stimulation to examine the possible causal role of the hippocampus in episodic simulation and divergent thinking, because if you scan people, you can ask the question, does applying TMS to the angular gyrus indeed impact activity in the hippocampus in a way that's related to task performance? And you might not be surprised to know that the answer to both of those questions is yes. So this is reported, PNS paper in 2020. So in separate sessions, this is a slightly different TMS protocol. Continuous theta burst stimulation was applied to either the angular gyrus or the control region on the vertex just before people went into the scanner and performed a couple of different tasks. They had word cues during scanning and either imagine a future event, did the AUT imagine alternative uses of an object, or performed the sentence generation control task that I briefly summarized before. Details of the imagined experiences were coded into internal and external using the same scoring that I talked about earlier. And the AUT performance was scored for both fluency, that's the number of novel and appropriate uses, and flexibility, that's that categorical measure we talked about earlier, categories of novel and appropriate uses. And what happened is, if we look on the top here of the figure, what we can see is that internal details, when people imagined a future event, they came up with fewer internal or episodic details in that imagined event following stimulation to the angular gyrus. Compared to the vertex, this is a nice replication of the previous study I just showed you about. No impact on the control task, no impact on external details. The new finding here is that you see a similar effect of stimulation to the angular gyrus on both the fluency and flexibility measures of the AUT. So following stimulation to the angular gyrus, they're not coming up with as many novel creative uses of objects. Now, what about the hippocampal part of it? Well, indeed, there were a couple of hippocampal regions that showed decreased activity during both the future simulation task and the alternate uses task following stimulation to the angular gyrus. So consistent with the study, the science paper that I told you about earlier, we were seeing an impact on connected regions. There was decreased activity when you imagined a future event, came up with alternate uses, but no impact on the control task. And importantly, the reduced hippocampal activity during divergent thinking and episodic simulation was linked to performance reductions. So wrapping up, then we see these nice impacts, we think on divergent creative thinking and on future imagining that we think support the constructive episodic simulation hypothesis. But now in my final few minutes, I think I have a few, right? Yeah, good. I want to come back to this point that I started on, talking about the idea that this flexible recombination process that we think is supporting future imagining and divergent thinking can also result in memory errors when elements of past experience are miscombined. And there are a couple of different lines of work that support this idea. I'm going to tell you about one that was explored in some experiments that were carried out in my lab by my then graduate student, Alexis Carpenter. And this is basically the idea that we're investigating here. And these experiments tested this idea about the role of flexible episodic recombination in memory errors by adapting what we refer to, what we call an associative inference paradigm. So we didn't go at this directly with future thinking. We thought this associative inference paradigm was a better route to testing this idea about flexible episodic recombination. So what is associative inference? Associative inference I would define as an adaptive process that allows us to combine related information acquired in distinct episodes to make novel connections that we haven't directly experienced. So to take an everyday example, imagine you're out for a walk in your neighborhood. You see an older man walking a poodle one morning in one part of your neighborhood. Next day, you're out walking a different part of your neighborhood, and you see a woman about the same age walking the same poodle. If you combine information from those two episodes, you can infer that they're probably husband and wife, they're closely related in some way because they're walking the same, different parts of the same neighborhood, walking that same dog. That would be associative inference, and you're recombining information from two different episodes. So we're trying to capture that in the lab and see whether the underlying processes that support that adaptive function also can lead you to misremember experiences. So here is the experimental paradigm. What you do is you see a bunch of slides of people and objects. So you're going to see a man holding a construction toy. And later on, you're going to see that construction toy, the item, being held by a different person, the little boy. And much like the neighborhood poodle walking example I just gave you, if you can combine information from those episodes, you can infer that the man and the boy are related. You got to remember the two episodes and recombine information in order to do that. So the hypothesis here was that the capacity for flexible episodic recombination can support inference across related events, but might also leave memory prone to error or distortion, such as source misattributions, where details of a related event are mistakenly attributed to the original event. So this would be akin to mistakenly remembering when you get the inference right about the man and the woman being related, that might more easily lead you to misremembering where you saw one versus the other. You might confuse the locations when you get the inference right. So that's what we wanted to explore here. And so this is how the experiment works. You see the man in the construction toy in a living room, and notice that he's in a living room with a white couch. Then later on, you're seeing a bunch of other images as well. You see this BC image, the little boy with a construction toy in a living room. Notice that it's a brown couch. And we're going to be interested in what happens to your memory for the white couch versus the brown couch as a function of whether you are able to correctly make the inference that these two people are related. We don't have to worry about the encoding instructions. I don't want to bog you down in too much detail here, but they come in, they see a bunch of items, the AB, the man and the construction toy. Then they get a bunch of BC items, the construction toy now with the little boy. Then they come back for a second session the next day. We test them for their memory for like the brown couch versus the white couch. Then they get a memory test for the direct association and critically the associative inference. And then they get a second test for some of the items for memory for this details of the scene. And so what we're interested in here is the question of what happens to your memory for the scene in which you saw this guy as a function of whether you get the inference right or whether you get it wrong. So here, the correct answer would be, oh, he was in a room with a white couch. What we're interested in is what leads to you sometimes claiming that you saw him in a room with a brown couch. Long story short, you're going to make that mistake more when you get the inference right about the two people being related than when you get the inference wrong. And I'm going to skip over some of these details. These are some of the predictions. And this is the critical finding. What we're looking at here is the proportion of false memories. That's when you're claiming you saw the guy in a room with a brown couch. It was a white couch. And we're plotting this as a function of whether you got the inference right, that the man and boy are related, or whether you got it wrong. And here, what we're looking at is when we give you that source memory test for the details before the inference test or after. And as you can see, you get this boost in memory errors, claiming that you saw the guy in a room with a brown couch when you get the inference right, but only when your source memory is tested after the inference test. And the idea there is that it's during the inference test that you're doing this recombining kind of operation, and that's what boosts the memory errors. So we took this as evidence supporting the constructive episodic simulation idea. And the conclusion is that when people make a correct inference about the relationship between elements of events that they didn't experience directly, they might more fully recombine details from the two episodes and details from one episode migrate to and become incorporated into the later, the related episode. Supports a key idea of the constructive episodic simulation hypothesis. Now, I know I'm probably short on time now, so I'm just gonna tell you, without going through all the details, that after this, Alexis Carpenter led a very cool fMRI study in which basically the study looked at multivoxel patterns associated with some of those scenes. So here's that brown couch living room scene, right? And in this experiment, before they do any encoding of, men, the man and the boy and the construction toy, they go into the scanner and we try to get an estimate of the multivoxel pattern associated with that living room, with that brown couch in the living room. And then we're going to run them basically through the same experiment that I just told you about. And what we're going to ask is the question of, is there evidence of this brown couch pattern that we estimate from in the pre-experimental session being more frequently reinstated after you got the inference right than after you got the inference wrong, when we know from the behavioral data, that's when you're making the memory error. And I'm going to skip through the gory details. I'd be happy to go back to this when anyone wants to answer question, but basically the bottom line from the study was that in 3 regions that we were interested in, we thought might be playing a role in this, there was more evidence of the brown couch pattern, that's what I'm highlighting here, after you took the inference test than before, and that's when you're also making more memory errors. So there's more evidence of this brown couch pattern being reinstated when they're claiming more frequently, yeah, I saw that guy in a room with a brown couch, which is just after they've gotten the inference correct. So let me wrap up then. We think that the fMRI data provides support for our hypothesis that we entered the study with, and a key component of the constructive episodic stimulation hypothesis as well. So I just want to close by going back to 2 of my favorite psychologists, Sir Frederick Bartlett, who ended his book by saying that remembering is not the re-excitation of innumerable fixed, lifeless, and fragmentary traces. It's an imaginative reconstruction or construction. And I think all the work we're doing fits so beautifully with Bartlett's idea. And then finally, we'll give Endel Tolving the last word, who in his really beautiful Annual Review of Psychology 2002 paper, talking about episodic memory and its role in future thinking, said that if there is hope for a more appropriate assessment of the uniqueness of episodic memory, it may come through the realization that mental time travel involves awareness not only of what has been in the past, but also of what may come. This awareness, he argues, has transformed the world into one of culture and civilization. We need our future thinking in order to build cultures and civilizations that our distant ancestors, who he thinks lack this capacity, could not possibly imagine. So with that, I'll thank my members of my lab, collaborators, funding sources, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for that great talk. So we can have people type questions in the chat on Zoom or raise your hand here. Anyone want to kick us off with some questions? Yes.
Thank you so much for the talk. I kept thinking about imagining in a timeless kind of dimension.
Yeah.
Do you mind just talking a little bit about imagining something that had happened in the past, future, whereas just imagining in general? I'm imagining moving.
That's a really great question. It's something we've looked at. I didn't have time to work it into this talk, but I did mention briefly the work of Hassimus and McGuire on scene construction, where you're imagining a scene. Imagine being on a sandy beach. It could be in the present, the future, or the past. And so how much of what I've been talking about specifically has to do with thinking into the future versus just imagining and recombining? we've looked at this in some experiments in our lab, particularly in very recent work with Johannes Marr. If you're interested in this topic, that I'd recommend a paper in Journal of Experimental Psychology General, published 2022, where we've tried to separate out these different components, because as you very astutely recognize, they're not the same thing. And I would say that a lot of what I've been talking about here is going to occur independently of whether you're imagining into the past, imagining the present, or imagining into the future. But that imagining into the future is really the thing that has a lot of functional payoff. And that's why we think we want to focus on it. And people have argued, and I would agree, that there are some unique aspects of thinking into the future that you don't see when you're just imagining the present or imagining into the past. There are some differences. So it's a very important question. I think the field still has a lot more work to do to tease apart those issues. But if you want to look at what I think is, a pretty good experimental attack on that issue, there's the paper by Marr and Schacter. It's Journal of Experimental Psychology, uses a paradigm designed to tease apart those factors. Yeah.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. So my question is for the episodic recombination paradigm for imagination. Do you think there are other paradigms of imagination that exist in parallel? If not, then do you think the episodic recombination, like only via recombination do we imagine, do you think that will impose a constraint on what are the subset of things we can imagine?
Yeah, another really good question. I don't think that episodic recombination is the only thing going on when we imagine the future or imagine the past or imagine into the present. We have focused on that, and we've tried to isolate the episodic contribution because we think it's important and because I think it does relate to memory errors, as I've focused on. But for example, there's a major contribution of semantic memory, semantic knowledge to future thinking. And that's been looked at by various people. One of the kind of interesting sources of evidence for that, for the semantic contribution to future thinking, semantic recombination, if you will, recombining general knowledge as opposed to recombining specific experiences that we focused on, comes from interesting work with patients who exhibit the syndrome of semantic dementia. So these are folks who, as a result of damage or disease, primarily in the anterior temporal lobe, a part of the temporal lobe very much involved in semantic processing and some other regions as well, they have really major deficits in semantic knowledge. Their episodic memory, if you can assess their episodic memory independently of semantic knowledge, like for example, by showing them abstract pictures and asking them, did you see this before? They're fine, they do well, as long as you don't tap into their deficient semantic knowledge. What role do they play in the story I've been telling? Well, there are several studies that have shown that they do exhibit seemingly disproportionate deficits when imagining into the future as opposed to remembering the past. And the idea is that this reflects the fact that for most of us, semantic knowledge provides kind of a scaffolding for imagining into the future and works in concert with episodic information. So it's called the semantic scaffolding hypothesis. So the point I want to make there is just that we're by no means claiming, even though our focus has been on the episodic contributions, that it's the only thing or even the most important factor for imagining into the future or creative thinking or anything like that. And in fact, in that theoretical paper on creative thinking with Benedict and colleague, the Nature Reviews paper published a few months ago, that really goes into some detail in outlining both the episodic and semantic contributions to divergent thinking. In the creativity field, really the emphasis has been primarily on the semantic memory contributions. And so we and others have been bringing this episodic component into that discussion. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question about the ESI. I
Yeah.
was trying to think about like how that might work sort of mechanistically, and I guess it's sort of waking up that core network.
Yep.
In a way. And I was wondering, I guess I had a couple questions. First of all, like, did you look at all at the time scale of like when the ESI occurred relative to those follow-up tasks, and sort of how long this ESI effect might last? And then second, I was just wondering, sorry if you already answered this, but like about the specificity of exactly what they were calling during the ESI and whether that affected their answers afterwards.
Yeah, both excellent questions. We have not really, I think Kevin Medor actually at one time may have done an analysis, tried to do analysis on your latter question. But everybody, they've just seen the video and people are kind of at ceiling and there's not all that much to remember from it. So I don't think there was any predictive relationship between what they remembered out of the video during the ESI and subsequent performance. I think that's right. Your first question about the time course, how long do the effects last, is a very important one. What turned out to be a really good thing with the ESI, the fact that we could do these experiments within subjects, we wanted to try to get the effects within subjects, because when you do it between subjects, there's just so much variability and so much noise, very hard to see anything. So we went to within subject design, and we separated the sessions by a week in the initial studies, as I mentioned. The idea was, well, there could be a carryover. If these effects last, you'd want to put a week in there, because otherwise, if there's a carryover from ESI to control, you're gonna wipe out the effects. If when they do the control induction, they're being impacted by having done the prior ESI. So there were no carryover effects in those experiments, suggesting, well, it doesn't last a week, right? Then we wanted to do scanning experiments. And then you've got to do the task kind of back to back, you counterbalance them. And so now it's kind of, you're holding your breath, you're doing some behavioral pilot testing in the lab, and you want to see, is there a carryover when you have ESI immediately followed by control versus control immediately followed by ESI. So the good news for the scanning study was that there's no difference. The bad news is that means the effects don't last very long at all. We think of them as kind of a retrieval orientation effect, getting people into a particular retrieval orientation. And then once you get them out of that, the effects go away. Now, I know that there are some people trying to do training studies with the ESI. It's been used in a variety of labs. And there is one lab in particular, I think the paper was just recently accepted, where they were able to show that if you repeatedly do ESI, you can get some effects that last, maybe in a way that would make a difference in everyday life. And in fact, there is a related procedure that predates the ESI. It's called memory specificity training, that has been primarily done in clinical populations, depressed, anxious, and similar populations, where it had been shown that inability to retrieve specific memories is related to the condition. And the thought was that if you can get them to retrieve more specific memories, that might be helpful. And so they put them through this memory specificity training, which is much more involved than our simple ESI. And there's a whole literature on that showing that they do get effects that can last and can impact patient well-being. They just don't do the experiments with the kind of tight control that we have done, because we're doing it for different purposes. Yeah.
Thank you for the great talk. So I'm wondering, when we remember or imagine, we have the content of what we are imagining or remembering in the brain. And at the same time, we also have the command saying, oh, imagine or remember. So the two components, content and the command, do you have insights about how they can be deassociated?
Say a little bit more. What do you by?
So
Because the content is different when you remember a past event versus imagine a future event.
Yeah, but for example, if we are imagining the future event, there is the scene that we are imagining, and also the brain knows we are imagining. So this brain knows, and the brain says that let's imagine this part and the actual things that we are imagining. Can these two parts be separated?
That's not a question if I'm understanding you, I think that's a kind of intriguing question. It's not something that we've tried to separate. I'm not sure exactly how you would go about that, but something to think about. It's not something that we've really focused on or attempted to do.
Okay, thank you.
We have two questions in the chat.
Yeah.
Then we're running. So one I think is related to a question someone was asking earlier about imagining future versus imagining in general.
Yeah.
So Julian says, thanks for the amazing talk. What do you think about extending this research to visual mental imagery in general, as opposed to imagination of future events? Is it possible to have imagery with elements not relying on episodic memory?
Yes, it is. That's another really good question. I'm really glad we've had so many good questions. We confronted that in our very first study, the Donna Addis study, 2007, that I showed you at the beginning, where you see those similar increases. Remember the past, imagine the future. One of the control tasks was a standard visual imagery task, because we know that people can just imagine objects and other kinds of general knowledge. And what we wanted to see was whether imagining a specific future event produces increases above and beyond that kind of general visual imagery. So we actually included that as a control task in the very first study that we did. Stephen Koslin, who is one of the giants of the cognitive neuroscience and cognitive psychology of visual imagery, was a colleague of mine in the department. And we would talk about that as, we want to show that what we're studying is not the same thing as Koslin type visual imagery, like imagine a house or imagine a cat, things of that nature. So we use that as a baseline, and what we saw was above and beyond that kind of baseline. That's a very good question.
Thank you. One other question on Zoom has to do with development. I think when people were registering, people had asked about this as well.
Yeah.
Are there any similar studies of memory and imagination done on children? This person gives the example of 7-year-olds and how that might be
Yes.
different than adults.
Yes, another good question. Yes, there are. In fact, one of the important early papers in this area was by two developmental psychologists, Tance and O'Neill, published in 2001, that introduced the term episodic future thinking, which is we talk about episodic simulation. We also use the term episodic future thinking. And they're developmental psychologists. And so they were interested in the question of, when does this ability to think episodically about the future, when does that come online? And while I'm not an expert in that area, my sense from their work, as it's evolved over the years, is that it seems to be something that comes in roughly in parallel to episodic memory, maybe between the ages of 3 and 5, with some further development beyond that. So yeah, there is a literature on that. And in fact, it's from the developmental literature that the term episodic future thinking was first appeared.
So I think we're short on time, so we can wrap things up, and then those who are joining for the dinner can continue the conversation. So thank you so much, Professor Schacter. We really appreciate your talk. And just to the audience, both online and in person, thank you. And if you have suggestions for future one-on-one talks, we welcome them. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.